Well, I woke up this morning, Scott. I had already been concerned about the attackums and the storm shadows that are now striking into Russia per the directives of the United States, the UK, and the rest of NATO. Russia had responded and had potentially called the bluff these escalations. So, Scott, I wanted to ask you, what do you make of how Russia has responded and what are the implications of this move going forward?
Well, I don't think there's any the word you used, concerns or questions about what was done. Russia has responded using a new ballistic missile, never before seen by the public at large. Apparently, U.S. intelligence has been monitoring this for some time and has called it an experimental medium-range ballistic missile. Medium range generally refers to a missile that operates between the ranges of 1,000 and 3,000 kilometers. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has given it a name, Orezhnik. Hazel is the interpretation. I guess it's a slang term. Hazelwood is wood that the overlords used to fashion a cudgel out of to beat the serfs into submission. And so Orezhnik is a Russian cudgel to beat its enemy into submission. We don't know much about the operational parameters of the missile. We know that it was fired from Kapustin Yar, which is a Russian ballistic missile test launch facility. Normally, you fire from the west to the east. So Kapustin Yar is normally oriented towards the east. This time, the missile was oriented from the east to the west, facing towards Ukraine. Ukrainians apparently had been tipped off about this by U.S. intelligence because they had been saying at least 24 hours in advance that the Russians were preparing an RS-26 Rubyezh, or frontier missile, which was a missile that was developed by the Russians back in 2014-15, flight tested 15-16, and ready to come into operation in 2017, but the Russians pulled it back because of concerns related to the New START Treaty and the then, in effect, INF Treaty, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Apparently, the SS-26 had the ability to fly to intercontinental ballistic missile range. That's over 5,000 kilometers if it used a single warhead. But if you put a three-warhead configuration on it, then it flew to intermediate nuclear forces range, which would have made it illegal. And the Russians weren't thrilled about having to get it categorized in a way, so they pulled the missile back. It didn't go into operation, but just this past summer, Vladimir Putin said that because the United States and NATO had deployed intermediate range missiles into Europe, the U.S. sent a missile complex to an exercise in Denmark, I believe, this last summer, that he was considering bringing the SS-26 back into operation. And so when you combine the Ukrainian description of an SS-26, and what that means is they were shown a satellite photograph by the United States. The United States may not have told them that it was an experimental missile, because this would have required the United States to give up more than just an image. They would have to talk about very sensitive intelligence on how they knew about this this development. But visually, if the Ukrainians were calling it an SS-26, and the satellite imagery would probably be of fairly good resolution, visually it must have resembled an SS-26, which means that it's a road mobile missile using a 6-axle launcher, and it's being fired from a launch canister that is carried by the launcher and then erected and fired. So there's a lot of implications here. One of which is, if it's that, using that design, it's probably a derivative of the SS-26. And this is something that the Russians have done in the past. To give you an example, back in the 1980s, in 1983, 84, the Russians did a rapid development of a missile they called the Skorost. What it was They took the SS-25, the second and third stage of the SS-25. They took the SS-20 post-boost vehicle, which had the capability of having 3 warheads, and they married that on, and rapidly, in less than a year, created a missile that was a very cheap 3-warhead missile that could flood Europe. And it didn't go into production, but they developed it very, very quickly. What we could be seeing here, given the fact that technology is advanced and such, between 2015, 17, we're now talking, close to a decade, advancements in propulsion, in other materials, that the Russians wouldn't just want to bring the Rubej, the SS-26 into full-scale production, but rather take a modification of the Rubej. Is believed to be comprised of 2 stages of the SS-27 Yars missile, intercontinental ballistic missile. What we may have here is that the Russians have decided to only take one of the stages and maybe put a new post-boost vehicle on it. Clearly, this missile has a capability of delivering at least 6 warheads. We saw that. And these 6 warheads appear to be canister warheads, meaning that they deploy at least 6 submunitions per warhead, because the visual data of the missile hitting the Dnipropetrovsk factory, the former Yuzmash factory, a ballistic missile factory, which, according to the Russians, the United States and Great Britain were working at this factory with the Ukrainians to build short-range and intermediate-range missiles that were going to be used against Russia. So the Russians took out the Ukrainian missile factory using this Orezhnik missile. But the visual data shows 6 distinct entries, and which implies 6 warhead releases from a bus, and each one of those had 6 submunitions that were going down to the target. So this is basically a saturation weapon, able to saturate an area with sufficient destructive power. The missile apparently is also nuclear capable, because the terminology used by Vladimir Putin implied that it could also be a nuclear capable, but they used it in a non-nuclear mode. But this is a new missile. It's interesting. The U.S. says they only think there's a handful of these out there. But again, depending on what modifications were made, if they're using an existing RS-26 launcher, it's just a matter of building the canisters. That's not complicated. There are canister manufacturing, industrial facilities that will be able to do that. Once you have the design down, it's a matter of simply producing it, and then the missile, if you're using an existing stage, that stage has already been produced, and the modifications to that won't be that difficult to do. The post-boost vehicle would probably be the most difficult aspect of it, because you're taking something that is clearly new. I mean, I've been studying Russian missiles for a while, and this is the first time I've seen anything like this. The 6 warhead with submunitions on on what is a strategic asset. So this is a new development, and it's a new bus, but it worked. And once it works, then put it into full-scale production. I don't see any reason why the Russians wouldn't be able to go into serial production with this system once they made a decision. And so the idea that there's only a handful of these, that's the U.S. lulling itself into a false sense of complacency, as opposed to anything. But this is a meaningful development. It's not an intercontinental ballistic missile. But it's a missile that has the range to strike anywhere in Europe. It has speeds that cannot be. It's defined as a hypersonic missile, which means that it's more than just a ballistic missile. That means that at some point in time, this missile changes from a ballistic trajectory and maneuvers before releasing the warheads. There's nothing in the Western arsenal that can shoot it down, and the Russians have said we'll continue to to employ these as necessary. We will mirror any actions undertaken. So if Ukraine launches another missile attack using ATACMS or Storm Shadow or Scalp on Russian territory, it will get a retaliation similar to this. That's an absolute guarantee. And if the West continues to escalate, then Russia will mirror that, which means there's other weapons out there that Russia could bring in. The SS-26, the SS-24, SS-27. I mean, there's, and maybe even new missiles that they haven't yet announced. You know, the Russians have said for a while that there's a whole new category of missiles and new warheads that they've never used. The world is not familiar with. We're still waiting for the operational employment of what is known as the father of all bombs, the giant EMP weapon, not EMP, I'm sorry, a thermobaric weapon. So, you know, this is the Russians aren't messing around. Anybody who thought the Russians were bluffing, and I don't know if people watched Putin's speech. If you did, you probably need to go change your underwear, because this man is not messing around. The decisions have been made. I've been saying this for some time now, but Vladimir Putin's speech confirmed it. The decisions have been made. He said there will be no hesitation. The orders have been given. They will mirror every activity done against them, up to and including using nuclear weapons in retaliation. That's the path we're on right now. You know, I see in your comment, oh, Scott's going to scare us. If you're not scared, you're stupid. You're a moron. You're an idiot. You might as well go drink some poison and die, because that's what's going to happen to you if we don't change this trajectory. And the other thing we have to recognize as a collective, the American people, is what's happening here. These actions undertaken by the Biden administration are not reflective of a functioning democracy. This is literally what we're witnessing is a coup d'etat of the establishment, the deep state, which has imposed itself on a faltering Biden presidency. I don't even know if Biden's calling the shots. Clearly, his cognitive ability has diminished sufficiently. We do know that last September, when given the alternative, given the option to launch, he said no, because the Defense Department warned him exactly what was going to happen. The fact that the United States knew that the Russians had this Orezhnik missile under development, it probably means they had some insight whether or not Putin was going to use it. And this is something that Lloyd Austin was aware of when he said, no, we're not going to green light the use of ATACMS missiles, Storm Shadows by Ukraine, because it won't change the outcome on the battlefield. And what it will do is create an escalation that takes us down a path we don't want to go. And that is a path of existential nuclear conflict with Russia. We know that Blinken disagreed. Blinken is of the school that says the Russians are bluffing. And Blinken continuously and has continuously pressured Joe Biden into overturning Austin's veto. And it appears that he succeeded. But the impetus for this doesn't have to deal with any new threat from Russia, et cetera, other than the fact that Russia is winning the war on the ground in Ukraine. It had to do with Donald Trump's victory on November 5th. Donald Trump's victory on November 5th has sent a shockwave through the establishment that fears what Donald Trump might do with NATO, with Ukraine, come January 20th. And so they are implementing a crash program that's designed between now and January 20th to fundamentally alter the reality of the Ukrainian conflict to the detriment of Russia, and therefore make it more difficult for Donald Trump to unravel it and achieve what he wants. This is the so-called Trump-proofing of NATO and Ukraine. The American people did not vote for this. The American people voted for the exact opposite of this. Insofar as Ukraine was on the ballot, the decision was to get out of Ukraine and prevent a nuclear war with Russia. Instead, now the Biden administration is moving in a direction of, doubling down on Ukraine, and we're moving towards a path of nuclear war with Russia.
In the United States and their NATO allies said that they give their permission to use long-range weapons against targets inside Russia. The further course of action will be determined based on the threats to the security of the Russian Federation. We believe that we have the right to use our weapons against military facilities of countries who allow their weapons to be used against ours. And in case of an escalation, we will act as decisively in a mirror fashion.
Earlier on November 21st, it was reported by Ukrainian sources that Russia had fired an intercontinental ballistic missile into the Dnipro area of Ukraine. And this comes as the U.S. has approved ATACMS long-range missile strikes deep into Russian territory. We know that that has already occurred over the last several days, and the UK has followed suit by firing storm shadows into the Kursk region, or giving Ukraine approval to fire those storm shadows into the Kursk region. So, Mark, please help us understand what is the significance of this, given that the reports are that, well, this missile that Russia used is not necessarily nuclear armed as of today, as it was used in this strike, that it is nuclear capable. And Vladimir Putin has come out, I believe, in the hours preceding our program, saying that this was a response to the escalations from the United States and NATO. What is your take on all of this?
Okay, so first of all, let me stop your Western framing right there. That is not the Russian perspective, right? These are Western weapon systems guided to target by Western satellites, and they have to be programmed, the firing sequence put into these missiles, because of the proprietary classified coding and software required by Western specialists. That is to say, they're fired by Western specialists. This was not a green light for a Kiev regime attack. This was the Biden administration of the United States launching ballistic missiles into Russia. This was the Keir Starmer administration in the United Kingdom firing cruise missiles into Russia. That is the Russian perspective. That is the way they regard this. Putin has laid this out. It's not reported by the Western media, right? What Putin has months ago specifically said about this issue. And there was a holdoff at the time. But now with Biden out the door and Trump coming in, they've decided to go for broke and escalate to some type of Gotterdammerung world-ending conflict. Russia regards this as a declaration of an act of war, a declaration of war by the US and the UK, by NATO on Russia. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to wake up to nuclear missiles tomorrow, probably. Russia is, this is almost certainly factored in the Biden administration's decision to escalate, that whatever rhetoric they may present about Putin as some type of dictator and madman and everything, they know they have a psychological profile of him. He is cautious and pragmatic and calculating and supremely rational, right? So they feel liberated by that. They feel the need not to be rational because they know that he is rational. And so they are calling his bluff. And we've heard a lot of nuclear rhetoric out of Russia, right? I mean, not necessarily out of Putin, but by Medvedev, whom, should be properly regarded as a government, a proxy for Putin, right? As the hawk, right? Good cop, bad cop, however you want to look at it. We've seen Putin ratify Russia's newly expanded nuclear use doctrine, which is intended to deter further NATO direct involvement, and has obviously failed. They're calling Putin's bluff. And I think it is a bluff, right? I don't see any foreseeable situation where Russia uses nuclear weapons, not even tactical nuclear weapons, in Ukraine. I don't think it is going to happen. The only situation where it could happen is if the U.S. spends a year redirecting all of its military forces from around the world and gathers them all together for one gigantic conventional assault and storms through Russian defenses and marches on Moscow, some type of Tom Clancy fan fiction scenario. That's the only case where Russia would start using tactical nuclear weapons, whatever the expanded use doctrine and so forth. So I think on top of this, Putin knows that this is a trap, right? That Biden is escalating like this. And Biden has officially allowed, we've already seen them, U.S. contractors officially approved to serve in Ukraine, which will certainly see a big increase in their numbers. At least we've seen these U.S. attack-em strikes into Russia proper territory. We've got the word that anti-personnel mines for the first time have been transferred to the Kiev regime. They've sent them anti-tank mines before, but supposedly due to casually tossed aside convictions of Joe Biden, they previously haven't sent anti-personnel mines. And we know that the Kiev regime is desperately short of mines at this point. And they're going to write off $5 billion of U.S. taxpayer loans to the Kiev regime. Sorry, U.S. taxpayers, you lose $5 million. Million. That's another one. $5 billion.
Yeah.
$5 billion of U.S. taxpayer dollars. Half of what was provided this year, just to get it sign it off. So you guys lose $5 billion. This is the escalation we've seen just in the last 2 weeks, and there's still some 10 weeks to go until we finally see the end of Biden. This is a trap, right? They are trying to provoke Russia into an escalation that will make it impossible for the Trump administration to de-escalate. I don't believe in any deal, any 24 hours or any peace, but at the very least, the Trump administration could attempt to de-escalate the U.S. role in the conflict, right? They're trying to make that impossible. And Trump, Putin, certainly the Putin administration certainly knows that. And Biden knows that Putin knows that. So they may feel they can get off salami slicing, with the escalation once again and count on a limited Russian response. Whatever red lines Putin has quite clearly indicated on this matter before. And Putin knows that, if they can just hold out for 10 more weeks, then the situation could at least be somewhat different, right? Could potentially somewhat improve. That's not at all guaranteed, particularly with the number of neocons that Trump is surrounding himself with. I just saw that the newly nominated ambassador to NATO for the Trump administration, that he has previously condemned the Biden administration for not escalating enough with Russia. Things like that don't give me a warm fuzzy. And Mike Waltz and Mark Rubio and the like. But we'll leave that, and we can suck on hopium if we want to believe that Trump is going to do something. But at least there is the possibility. So I think that Putin may very well have a measured response now and leave the right and the room for a more significant response later, rather than jumping to a major counter escalation. And there's a question: deterrence, right? This is a matter of deterrence. The West has fired ballistic missiles into Russia, right? Yeah, they've still got this fig leaf of implausible deniability and a proxy, but Russia's well aware of what the situation really is, and there is a question of deterrence and credibility at stake, and that has to be weighed against everything else. So today, in the last 24 hours, we've seen at least part of Russia's response, and Russia fired missiles towards the Kiev regime-held Ukrainian city of Dnipropetrovsk on the Dnieper. There have been conflicting reports about exactly what was fired. The Kiev regime originally claimed that it was an intercontinental ballistic missile with a MIRV, a multiple independent reentry vehicle, a warhead, but with conventional warheads, not with a nuclear warhead. There's other speculation put out that this was a new type of Russian ballistic missile. And the news has been coming in as I've just been on a previous program. Putin has been delivering an address to the nation, to the Russian people. But from what I can quickly get here, if you'll forgive my earlier scanning of my Telegram messaging, but Putin has clarified that this was a new ballistic missile in Reshnik, which is a hypersonic missile capable of traveling at speeds of Mach 10, which is 3 kilometers per second, and that no Western defense system can stop, and that this was at least part of Russia's answer to the West. And, it's a strike at the Kiev regime, right? They targeted military industrial facilities in Dnipropetrovsk. It is certainly not a direct attack or on the US or the UK. We may yet see the transfer of Russian weapon systems to figures that will, use them against the US and the UK in response. CNN ran stories a couple of months ago, the last time the pressure mounted on these long-range strikes, that Russia was about to transfer long-range advanced anti-ship missiles to the Houthis, to the Ansar movement in Yemen, which has been conducting a almost surprisingly effective blockade of the Red Sea against Israeli and allied Western shipping, including drone attacks, cruise missile attacks, and supposedly, allegedly, hypersonic missiles against Western warships in the Red Sea, which has almost certainly caused, on at least 2 occasions, U.S. aircraft carriers who were engaged of whack-a-mole in the Yemeni desert to very little effect to run tail out of the theater after being targeted. So you could imagine that if the Houthis get their hands on Russian and more advanced weapons, that they will be very eager to use them, and that there is every potential that U.S. sailors and Marines could find themselves paying the price for Biden's leaving the stage Gotterdammerung escalation. Again, whether that's Biden or Sullivan and Blinken, that's neither here nor there. It's the administration. So we're on a precipice, right? I don't think we're on an immediate precipice to nuclear war, but we are definitely. I think it's fair to say that we have entered definitively. We've talked about it before, but we're in World War III. It just hasn't gone nuclear yet, right? That's the situation. And Putin, in his address, has effectively said that. He said the escalations, the continuing escalations by the West, have made it that this conflict is now